Have you ever wondered why the official history of the 19th century begins to crack at the seams the moment you apply a little logic to it? All our lives, we've been fed stories about simple men in rough boots and top hats who, armed with nothing but chisels, hammers, and horse-drawn carts, erected structures so complex that we would struggle to replicate them today, even with tower cranes, laser levels, and computer modeling. There is a lingering feeling that humanity has been deceived, globally, cynically, and very professionally. But any lie, no matter how grand, always leaves traces of inconsistency. And if we follow these traces, we can uncover one of the darkest secrets of the so-called Victorian era. In the mid-19th century, all over the world, as if on command from an invisible conductor, gigantic, incredibly complex structures of glass and metal suddenly began to rise. London in 1851, New York in 1853, Munich in 1854, followed by Madrid, Sydney, and St. Petersburg. The geography of this phenomenon is staggering. Official historians categorically assure us that these were merely exhibition pavilions. But the moment you think about this claim, it falls apart. We are asked to believe that empires spent colossal resources, thousands of tons of cast iron, millions of square meters of elite glass, just to build a building for 6 months, hold an exhibition of agricultural achievements, and then dismantle it, or, even more suspiciously, allow it to burn to the ground in a matter of hours. This approach contradicts all economic logic. To build a structure the size of several football fields, spending the budget of a small state just to show the public industrial goods and exotic plants for a short time is the height of wastefulness. Any power, whether a monarchy or a republic, is pragmatic to the bone. If something is created at such a cost, it must provide tangible, concrete, and long-term benefits that outweigh the investment. Yet, we are told about temporary pavilions, ignoring the fact that the technology of that time, according to textbooks, did not allow for such projects to be realized with such ease and speed. We are transporting ourselves to an era where, officially, there is no electricity, no welding, no heavy trucks, and no hydraulic lifts. The entire world runs on rivets, bolts, and steam power. And yet, before us stand buildings that are a century ahead of their time. This dissonance between the official level of development and the actual objects cannot be hidden. We look at these architectural miracles, but we often miss the main point. What is hidden behind the facade of admiration? And hidden there is the mathematical impossibility of their existence within the stated timeframes and with the stated technologies. To understand the scale of this discrepancy, you don't need to be a history professor. You just need to pick up a calculator and compare the known figures, which will leave nothing of the accepted version of events standing. Let's look at the specific numbers using the Crystal Palace in London's Hyde Park as an example, to see the sheer depth of this historical inconsistency. Official statistics state, the length of the structure was 564 meters. The height was 33 meters, and the total area reached nearly 74,000 square meters. These are scales comparable to the terminals of modern international airports. And we are asked to believe that this colossal miracle of engineering was erected in just 9 months. 9 months. Even today, building a standard shopping mall out of concrete and sandwich panels takes longer. Now, imagine the mid-19th century. No electricity, no welding, no tower cranes, and no trucks. Everything relied exclusively on physical strength, rivets, and bolts. If we believe the reports, only 2,000 men worked on the construction site. Here, ruthless mathematics comes into play. To meet the deadline, workers would have had to install thousands of glass panels and iron beams every single hour, without stopping for a second. Not for sleep, not for food. This is physically impossible, even with perfect labor organization. But even more shocking is the logistics of the materials, particularly the glass. We are talking about 300,000 sheets of elite quality. At that time, sheet glass remained a luxury item, and its production technology was incredibly complex and slow. The industrial method of drawing glass ribbons did not exist yet. Glass was blown by hand. A master would gather a molten mass on a tube, blow a huge cylinder, which was then cut and flattened in kilns. This was hellish labor, resulting in small sheets that were often cloudy and filled with air bubbles. Yet, in photographs of the palace, we see huge, perfectly transparent panels of standardized size. To produce such a volume by hand in a few months would have required an army of glassblowers larger than the population of a major city, and mountains of coal, the smoke from which would have blackened the sky over all of England. However, there are no records of such industrial mobilization. This leads to only one thought. The glass was not produced specifically for the palace in the 19th century. It was either taken from giant warehouses left over from another era, or the production technologies were completely different and hidden from the general public. The same applies to the metal framework. Thousands of tons of cast iron had to be cast, transported, and assembled. The railways of that time were single-track lines with low-power steam locomotives. Transporting such a volume of metal in such a short time would have paralyzed the country's transport system. Yet the newspapers of the time are silent about any logistical collapse. Cargo appeared on the site as if out of thin air. And who managed this impossible process? The architect credited with designing a building ahead of its time is Joseph Paxton. Not a world-renowned engineer, not a professor of architecture, but an ordinary gardener who served the Duke of Devonshire. The official version says that it was his experience building greenhouses that allowed him to create the Crystal Palace project. And here, historians, without intending to, give us a crucial clue. They are telling the truth, but we are not always ready to hear it. This structure truly was a greenhouse, a gigantic industrial greenhouse. The design created a specific microclimate inside: stable temperature, high humidity, and protection from ultraviolet radiation while allowing maximum natural light. These are ideal conditions for growth. But they weren't growing palms and exotic flowers to please the Queen's eyes. Building a facility the size of several football fields and spending a small state's budget for ficus trees is economically unsound. The conditions inside were created for something far more complex and significant. Pay attention to the climatic conditions that were artificially maintained inside these grandiose structures. Engineering schematics and surviving descriptions testify that the design of the Crystal Palaces created a perfect, powerful greenhouse effect. The interior space ensured a stable high temperature, elevated humidity, and reliable protection from ultraviolet radiation, all while maintaining maximum access to natural light. We are told this was necessary for the comfort of visitors and to display industrial achievements. But let's compare these conditions with the exhibits that were shown there. The halls displayed machinery, steam locomotives, metal structures, fabrics, and expensive carpets. Any technologist will confirm that for metal, high humidity is a death sentence. Corrosion begins to destroy mechanisms instantly. For fabrics, paintings, and tapestries, a humid environment is fatal as it provokes mold and rot. Why maintain a tropical microclimate in London for an exhibition of iron and textiles? It defies the common sense of preservation. However, for biological processes, heat and moisture are the absolute foundation of existence. If we view these buildings not as museums, but as giant laboratories, the excessive heating system and the strange water reservoirs disguised as fountains take on a frightening logic. These were ideal conditions for the accelerated growth of living organisms. Here we approach another global mystery of the 19th century, which official science prefers to sidestep: the incredible population explosion. After the strange and catastrophic events of the early century, which many alternative researchers call the mud flood or the climatic disaster of 1812 to 1816, the Earth's population suddenly began to grow exponentially. Cities that, judging by old engravings, stood half empty and buried in soil were suddenly filled with millions of inhabitants. Where did they come from in such a short time? We are told romantic stories that women at that time gave birth to 10 or 15 children, and all of them grew up successfully. But statistics and the realities of that time say the opposite. The level of medicine was extremely low. Sanitary conditions in cities were monstrous, and there were no antibiotics or basic hygiene products. Under such conditions, infant survival rates were critically low. Natural population growth physically could not produce the figures we see in official reports from the mid-century. The math of birth and death rates does not add up if we use only the factor of natural reproduction. This paradox has an explanation that may seem fantastic, but it fits perfectly into the technical specifications of the Crystal Palaces. If the population could not recover naturally at such speed, it means its numbers were increased artificially. These buildings, called palaces for the people, were actually incubators for creating them. Giant empty spaces, filled with light and moisture, served as factories for growing biological mass. New humans, intended to replace the population lost in the catastrophe and to become the workforce for the new industrial age. And the evidence of this process is not limited to architecture alone. If new people were not born in families but produced centrally, they had to be distributed around the planet somehow. And we find traces of this logistics in the mass movement of children, who were transported by train all over the world. If the theory of artificial population replenishment seems too bold, history provides us with facts that are impossible to ignore and demand an explanation. In the mid-19th century, coinciding with the appearance of the Crystal Palaces, a frightening phenomenon of mass orphanhood emerged worldwide. In cities from London to New York, hundreds of thousands of homeless children suddenly appeared. They were called foundlings, and the scale of this phenomenon was industrial. In the United States alone, between 1854 and 1929, a program known as the orphan trains operated. More than 250,000 children were transported from overcrowded eastern metropolises to the Midwest to populate empty territories. A logical question arises. Where did this army of children without parents come from? Where are their fathers and mothers? Historical chronicles of that specific period do not record massive world wars or plague epidemics that could have wiped out the adult population in such numbers, leaving the children alive. These orphans appeared as if from nowhere. They filled orphanages to the brim. They were loaded onto trains and sent into the unknown, to become new farmers, factory workers, soldiers. They had no past. They did not remember their roots. They were ideal, clean slates, ready-made cogs for the new economic system being built on the ruins of the old world. Confirmation of this strange generational gap can be found by anyone in their own family history. Try to build your family tree relying on real archival documents and birth records, not family legends. Most researchers inevitably hit a frightening wall dating back to around 1850. For 90% of the planet's population, family history cuts off exactly at this date or slightly later. Before this moment, emptiness and darkness. Either records are missing, archives burned down, or ancestors appear in documents already as adults with no recorded lineage. Official science writes this off as peasant illiteracy and poor paper preservation. But why does this memory lapse have such a global, planetary character? Why does it coincide in time with the construction of giant greenhouses and the so-called Industrial Revolution? Another link in this chain of evidence is the exhibitions themselves, held in those very Crystal Palaces. In the late 19th century, at expositions in Europe and America, the public was openly shown incubators for infants. This was presented as a miracle of medicine, as a kind of attraction. People paid money to look at premature babies lying in glass, heated boxes. But perhaps this was not a demonstration of advanced future technology, but the legalization of the remnants of a massive past program. When the need for industrial-scale human production faded, the equipment wasn't destroyed immediately, but monetized, turned into a show. We were shown the tip of the iceberg, called an attraction, to hide the true, far more global purpose of these devices. However, growing a physical body is only half the task. This huge mass of people, devoid of ancestral memory and attachments, needed to be organized. Having no past, they needed to be given a function, a purpose, and a place in the line. The biological material was ready, but for the system to work fully, it required the uploading of software. And it is at this very moment that an unprecedented process of social standardization and consciousness programming begins. If you have grown millions of biological units in artificial conditions, you inevitably face the next equally complex task. They must be socialized and integrated into the economic model. Empty vessels require filling. You need to upload a basic operating system into their consciousness, give them a language, instill skills for maintaining mechanisms, and, most importantly, create a false memory of a past they never had. It is precisely in the mid-19th century, simultaneously with the launch of the Crystal Palaces, that total unification occurs across the planet. The world, previously colorful and chaotic, switches to single standards as if a switch had been flipped. The metric system is introduced. Standard brick sizes and railway track widths are approved, and time is synchronized. But the most powerful tool of this unification becomes the introduction of the Prussian model of school education. We are used to being told that this was done for the enlightenment of the masses, but the true goal was far more pragmatic. The school of that period is not a temple of science, or a place for developing creative potential. It is a rigid factory assembly line. The bell for class, the bell for break, strict discipline, rote memorization, and identical uniforms. These are all elements of programming. Bio-robots, rolling off the incubator assembly lines, had to learn to obey signals and follow instructions without asking unnecessary questions. The identification of these new citizens was also purely utilitarian. Look at the surnames that appear en masse in documents of that time: Smith, Miller, Taylor, Carpenter, Mason. Millions of people suddenly receive surnames derived from professions. These are not ancestral names carrying the memory of generations, but inventory tags. You work in a smithy? You will be Smith. You grind flour? You will be Miller. This is the functional designation of a bio-unit in the new production chain. These people had no family history, so the system assigned them a function instead of a name. However, the process of accelerated growth did not pass without consequences for physiology. The product often had defects. The technology of rapid maturation had glitches, and the bodies of new people turned out to be fragile and subject to rapid wear. A study of exhibition catalogs in the Crystal Palaces reveals a shocking detail. Alongside weaving looms, prosthetics were exhibited in huge quantities. Artificial arms, legs, glass eyes, and false teeth occupied entire stands. Official history tries to explain this as the consequences of wars, but no major global conflicts were being fought at that specific moment. Why did peacetime need such a quantity of spare parts for humans? The answer lies in the physical imperfection of the grown organisms. Their teeth fell out, their limbs failed, and their weak bone systems could not withstand loads. Pay attention to Victorian fashion, rigid corsets and high-starched collars. This is not just style, it is a necessity. A weak spine and undeveloped back muscles in creatures grown, perhaps in conditions of different gravity, or in the aquatic environment of an incubator, required external support. The corset served as an exoskeleton, without which bodies simply broke. It was an era of forced cyborgization, hidden behind lace and cloth. This entire global system, from giant greenhouse incubators to factory schools and prosthetic plants, required a colossal amount of energy. Maintaining a tropical climate in millions of cubic meters of space, ensuring liquid circulation, and powering mechanisms using only coal and steam would have been impossible. Smoking chimneys would have covered the cities in a layer of soot in a week. But the palaces shone with cleanliness, and the air around them was fresh. This means the energy source was different, powerful, clean, and omnipresent. And to understand where electricity came from in a supposedly pre-electric era, we need to look at the physics of the buildings themselves from a different angle. Let's cast aside architectural lyricism and turn to the dry, ruthless physics of materials. If we view the Crystal Palace not as an aesthetic object, but as a technical device, a completely different picture opens up before us. Official history claims the building consisted of glass and iron. From the perspective of electrical engineering, glass is a dielectric, insulator, and iron is a conductor. When you alternate huge masses of dielectric and conductor in the form of a complex dome structure, you get not an exhibition pavilion, but a giant capacitor. The very shape of the building, resembling an arched waveguide, and the materials used indicate that this was a device for accumulating energy. But what energy? Electrical outlets as we know them did not exist yet. Gas lighting in such volumes would have been a fire hazard and inefficient. Yet contemporaries describe the palaces as glowing, with light penetrating every corner. The most likely explanation is that the structure itself accumulated atmospheric electricity, ether energy, which Nikola Tesla later wrote about, and which was so diligently erased from academic textbooks. If this building was a power station or a life support station, then the incubator theory receives powerful technical justification. Growing biological organisms in an artificial environment requires energy, and lots of it, to maintain stable temperatures, for ventilation systems, and especially for water circulation. The fountain system in the Crystal Palace is a separate engineering riddle. Jets of water shot up to a height of nearly 100 meters. Creating such pressure requires colossal power. Officially, we are told about steam engines hidden in towers. But 19th century steam engines were roaring monsters, spewing clouds of black smoke and soot. Visitors, however, described silence and crystal clear air inside and around the palace. No soot on the glass, no roaring. This means the pumps worked on a different principle, likely using that same atmospheric energy, and water was supplied from giant underground reservoirs, the existence of which we can only guess. Here we come to what is hidden from sight, the foundation. For a structure of this scale, a foundation going tens of meters deep is necessary. However, suspicious little attention is paid to this in construction reports, as if the Colossus was simply placed on the grass. This becomes possible only in one case, if the foundation and underground levels had already existed there for hundreds or thousands of years. The Crystal Palaces were merely a superstructure, domes installed atop the surviving infrastructure of an ancient civilization. Recall the strange feature of 19th century buildings in many cities around the world. First floors sunk into the ground. We are told this is cultural layer, but it is impossible to believe that people didn't clean up dirt for centuries until it covered their windows. The buildings are buried in soil. These are the traces of a global catastrophe, the so-called mud flood. The Crystal Palaces were erected on top of this chaos, connecting to the preserved underground communications of the old world. Tunnels, collectors, and pneumatic tube systems. The new masters of life didn't build this machine from scratch. they simply found a way to turn it on. The greenhouse palaces above received sunlight and ether energy. The underground levels provided logistics and resources, and between them, the continuous process of creating the service human took place. The system worked globally and flawlessly, fulfilling its task of repopulating the Earth. But in the late 19th century, something went wrong. The mechanism, which worked like a clock, was suddenly decided to be stopped in the most radical way. Why was Project Incubator, on which such resources were spent, urgently shut down and destroyed? The system glitch occurred in the late 19th century. Perhaps a critical mass of new people was reached, or the biological product began to show signs of uncontrollable behavior. But the puppeteers made the decision for a total cleanup. Project Incubator had fulfilled its task, and the giant laboratories, now unnecessary, turned into dangerous evidence. Empires needed to erase the traces of their origin and rewrite history once and for all. The liquidation scenario chosen was the same for all continents: fire. But this was not the kind of fire that starts from an overturned kerosene lamp or a stray spark. Look at the chronicles of the so-called Great Fires of Chicago, Boston, or Seattle through the eyes of an engineer, not a layman. Official reports are full of absurdities, but physical evidence speaks of the use of technologies of extreme power. Granite blocks of foundations and embankments didn't just crack from the heat, they melted. Stone flowed like plasticine, turning into a shapeless, glass-like mass. Metal structures evaporated, leaving only ghostly outlines, while wooden buildings and paper newspapers just a couple of blocks from the epicenter remained untouched. The temperatures required to melt granite cannot be obtained by the ordinary burning of urban buildings. This was not a natural disaster, but a targeted operation using directed energy weapons, destroying the centers of old star forts and the crystal palaces. The destruction of these majestic structures also had another economic goal. The domes and spires of the palaces served as receivers of atmospheric electricity. Pure, infinite, and, most importantly, free ether. At the turn of the century, a forced shift in the technological order occurred. Humanity was put on the hydrocarbon needle. Oil, coal, and gas are resources that must be extracted with hard labor, transported, and sold. Ether energy cannot be put in a barrel, restricted by a pipe, or sold for currency. It cannot be controlled by a meter. Therefore, free electricity technologies were declared pseudoscience, and the generators, the crystal palaces, were turned into piles of melted slag. We were indoctrinated to believe that smoking factory chimneys are a symbol of progress, while the clean energy of the past is a myth. We became slaves to tariffs, never suspecting that the civilization on whose ruins we live received light and heat straight from the air. The reality substitution operation was brilliant. Ugly concrete boxes were quickly erected on the ashes of the greenhouses. The memory of the mud flood and incubators was erased in literally 2 generations, replaced by a surrogate from textbooks. But the system left indelible bookmarks. The genetic code of those grown in Paxton's test tubes carries a ticking time bomb. We feel that this world is merely a set decoration. When we look at ancient statues or majestic ruins with inexplicable longing, it is not just an aesthetic feeling speaking within us. It is a subconscious search for the truth. It is phantom pain for a lost, golden age, and for our true creators, whoever they were. We live in a house we didn't build, and use things whose operating principles we have forgotten. But intuition tells us, once, we were something more than just service staff on this planet.